I froze when, at that company party, I saw my boss say to my wife, with a smile that no longer hid anything, "My dear, shall we dance?" And she went. As if it were natural. As if there were nothing wrong with accepting that invitation so sweetly, so familiarly. My eyes stung, but my voice came out dry, sharp, almost automatic. "Why is he so intimate with you?" And she, with the rehearsed serenity of someone who is guilty but has not yet been caught, replied, "It's just his way, but there's nothing between us." It was at that moment that I felt something inside me break. It wasn't anger, it wasn't rage, it was something more devastating: absence. The certainty that I was no longer there, at least not for her. Not in the way I always had been. I left. I left that party carrying in my chest the bitter taste of someone who already knows the truth before the proof. But I'm not the type to turn away with doubts in my heart. I investigated. I immersed myself in her silences, in the smiles I no longer saw, in the forgotten messages on her phone, in the odd hours, in the long showers, in the short calls with long apologies. Soon, the pieces began to fit together like a perverse puzzle. And each piece led me to the same place, to the man who reached out to dance with the woman I loved, as if she were already his. When I returned home, I found her on the couch, distracted. Maybe with guilt, maybe with relief at the thought that I had swallowed her lie. But I didn't come with questions, or accusations. I already knew. I simply said, "All you had to do was tell me you weren't happy with me anymore, and I would have walked out of your life, but what you did hurt me." And then she saw what I didn't say, felt the heavy silence that carried the pain of a betrayed man not only in his body, but in his soul. I saw her face pale, saw her eyes searching for words to hold back what had already escaped. But I turned my back. I left her house. Her life. In her mind, I imagined, there was a hidden victory. The freedom to experience what she believed to be love. The boss. The power. The new. That which shines at first, but later burns out. Because for him, she was never a promise. She was a pastime. An escape. A pretty toy that after a while, loses its charm. And when this man walked away, predictably, she was alone. And then, the penny dropped. Because betrayal isn't just breaking a promise, it's tearing apart memories, it's staining everything that was built with care. And it was in this emptiness that she realized she had lost the only man who looked at her with reverence, like someone contemplating a masterpiece. The only one who, even tired, brought flowers. Who listened to her pain, who would rather lose sleep than see her in silence. The only one who treated her like the love of his life. She came looking for me. And I listened. Not out of pity. Not out of longing. But because there was something inside me that needed to look at her and close the cycle. She knelt, cried, begged for forgiveness. She said she was weak. That she couldn't see what she had. She said she knew now. And maybe she did. Maybe the pain I saw in her eyes was real. Maybe the remorse was sincere. But some truths come too late. And love dies too. I forgave her. Not for her sake, but for mine. Because carrying resentment is remaining trapped in the prison the other person created. But we never became a couple again. Because there are things that, once broken, never come back together. And what I felt for her no longer lived within me. She saw, in my eyes, that the man who waited for her every night, who endured the silences, who embraced the weariness, no longer existed. And that was when she discovered that, besides me, she had also lost herself. But what she didn't know, is that days before she reappeared in my life, something happened. Something neither she, nor her boss, nor anyone else could have imagined. A silent discovery that made me look at my own story with new eyes. And that's what changed everything, including my destiny. What she didn't know, is that while she was falling into regret, I was finally, finding love again. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, created with a single purpose: show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and marks lives forever. Each plot carries a lesson, a mirror of reality that many ignore, until it's too late. Get ready. What you're about to hear is an intense, realistic, and deeply shocking story. Let it begin, the truth behind the lie. His name was Daniel. She was Helena. They were the kind of couple who, to others, seemed to have conquered time, the challenges, and the natural disagreements of life together. Married for 8 years, they lived in a spacious, well-lit apartment high up in a building overlooking the city, surrounded by a carefully constructed routine based on respect, affection, and small everyday concessions. Nothing seemed out of place. In the mornings, they shared coffee in comfortable silence, each with their favorite cup, while the low sound of the news filled the room with a familiarity that only years can sculpt. Helena preferred her bread and butter browned in the pan, while Daniel liked to add jam even on the busiest days. Small rituals that, to outsiders, mean little, but to those who live them, are the building blocks of a home. Daniel was a civil engineer, methodical, organized, and with a calm manner of speaking that exuded maturity and confidence. He was never the outgoing type, but he knew how to listen like few others, and this made him a welcome presence in any conversation, more for his attentive listening than for his opinions. Helena, on the other hand, was a creative publicist, sensitive to detail, possessed an energy that filled the space, with a striking voice and a refined aesthetic sense. They met in a coffee shop, still young, while seeking shelter from the rain one random afternoon, and from then on, their conversations never stopped. It was as if two different halves had, by some rare chance, learned to breathe in unison. And this united them. For a long time, their love seemed unshakable. Not the love of romantic comedies or fairy tales, but a real, adult love, full of imperfections, built more on daily choices than on grand declarations. In the early years, they faced financial hardships, job changes, apartment renovations, and even grief over the loss of a loved one together. Daniel was always their safe haven. He worked late when necessary, but he always let her know he was okay and was on his way home. He never forgot birthdays or the details she thought no one else noticed, like the day she got a different haircut or changed her perfume. Helena, on the other hand, was the emotional balance of the house. She had a way of seeing beauty in the little things, and it was she who brought life to the home, who made Saturdays moments of joy with her playlists blasting in the kitchen, or with the themed dinners she organized just for the two of them, as if it were a way of reminding them that they could still surprise each other, even after so long. Their apartment was simply decorated, but every corner told a story. There was a photo wall in the living room, with pictures of them on trips, birthdays, and parties with friends. Books were shared, and a corner of the bookshelf held handwritten letters exchanged during the times when they spent weeks apart because of work. They built a life based on conversations, laughter, and complicity. They had silent codes, looks that said it all, lingering hugs on difficult days. Daniel always enjoyed making breakfast on Sundays, while Helena read on the balcony, socks on her feet and a cup in her hands, lost in the pages and the light breeze that came through the cracks. In the eyes of the world, they were a strong couple. And indeed, they were. For a long time. Over time, however, the silent gears of routine began to creak. Nothing blatant, nothing that betrayed a serious problem. Just slightly longer silences, more automatic responses, less lingering kisses. Daniel began working more, taking on new responsibilities, and Helena, in turn, also began to advance in her career. The time that had previously been theirs was now divided between meetings, deadlines, appointments, work dinners, and mandatory social gatherings. Before they knew it, they were side by side on the couch, each in their own world. She, on her cell phone, responding to clients and colleagues, he, reviewing spreadsheets and contracts. But there was still affection. There was still laughter, albeit more infrequent. There were still good Sundays and some memorable nights. Daniel tried to keep their bond alive. Sometimes, he would leave hidden notes in her purse, with simple but affectionate phrases. He would buy her flowers for no special reason. He would invite her to dinners at places she loved, even after exhausting days. And she smiled, thanked, let herself be touched by it, but it always seemed like a piece of herself was somewhere else. Close friends noticed a subtle change but avoided commenting. After all, nothing seemed serious enough. Helena still wore her ring, Daniel still sought her out at work whenever he could. They continued to attend the same gatherings, dinners, birthdays. But her gaze, once so focused on him, now wandered more and more around her. There was a restlessness, an invisible search, like someone missing something they can't name. And Daniel, even without admitting it, noticed. He was a man attentive to details. He noticed her overly long sighs, the absent sparkle in her eyes, the forced tone of her laughter. He realized that her hugs were more of a social gesture than a refuge. But he preferred to believe it was just fatigue, just a phase, just the consequence of an overly intense adult life. And then came her promotion. A new position, more visibility, more travel, more meetings with company leaders. And with that, new people became part of her daily life. New perspectives, new conversations, new environments. Daniel was happy with the achievement, supported her as always, prepared a special dinner the night the news broke, and toasted with genuine enthusiasm. He was proud of her success and never felt threatened. On the contrary, he admired the way she asserted herself at work, how she was respected. But even so, deep inside, a small fissure began to form. Something undefined, yet uncomfortable. A suppressed intuition, without proof, without justification. And he didn't want to feed it. He chose to trust. It had always been that way. He chose to believe that love was greater than any fleeting doubt. With the new position came corporate events. Formal dinners, cocktail parties, weekend trips to conferences. Daniel saw Helena less at home, and when she was there, she seemed tired and distant. Sometimes she smiled at him with a look that seemed to apologize for something that still had no name. And he, instead of confronting her, tried to rekindle their bond. He planned a trip for the two of them, seeking to reconnect through memories, through the places where they were happy. But she postponed it. 3 times. Always with a convincing excuse. Always with a quick kiss and a sad smile. And then came the invitation to the company party. A large, elegant event, with all the employees and directors present. Helena asked him to go, saying she wanted to introduce him, that it would be good for both of them. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. He wore his best suit, bought flowers to deliver before they left, and sincerely complimented her dress. And when they arrived, he greeted her colleagues politely, taking in the atmosphere with the calm eyes of someone who prefers tranquility to ostentation. The party was noisy, sophisticated, full of speeches and rehearsed smiles. And amidst it all, he saw the man approaching. One of the company's leaders. A face he'd heard from hearsay but had never met in person. The man approached confidently, and before Daniel could comprehend what was happening, he heard the phrase that would mark the beginning of everything that would come next. But at that moment, he didn't know. He was still just the loving husband, the man who trusted, who loved, who held her hand with the certainty that there was truth there. That night, Daniel was still what he had always been, someone willing to weather any storm alongside the woman he chose. Little did he know that he was already walking on ashes. That the foundations of his marriage had begun to crumble long before that invitation to dance. But he didn't see it. Not yet. For him, there was only a uneasiness. A planted doubt. A growing, silent unease. But still, he chose to trust. Because, for Daniel, that was what love was, a daily act of faith. And at that point in the story, he didn't yet know how much it would cost to keep that faith. The music filled the room with rehearsed elegance, the fake smiles shimmered in the chandeliers, and Helena's perfume seemed to mingle with the air like a memory Daniel still wasn't sure he wanted to keep. He watched every gesture closely, not out of jealousy, but because of something more instinctive, an internal pulse that had begun to beat differently since he'd entered that room. It was as if he were being watched, but at the same time, excluded. He felt displaced from a reality that belonged more to her than to him. Helena seemed to float among her colleagues, greeting everyone with a glow he hadn't seen in his home for a long time, and her smile, once spontaneous and uniquely his, was now shared in symmetrical cuts for everyone around. Daniel observed calmly, as he always did, but inside, the silence screamed. The moment everything began to change didn't come with a bang, but with cruel gentleness. Her boss, who until then had been nothing more than a distant figure in meetings and vague comments, approached with firm steps and a confident expression. He was older, well-dressed, and possessed a cool charisma that seemed more like strategy than personality. Daniel extended his hand politely, received a calculated shake, and when he heard the phrase, "My dear, shall we dance?" he felt the ground slip away for a moment. The tone was intimate, there was none of the detachment one expects from a professional relationship. There was something more. Helena hesitated for a second, looked at Daniel with an expression that said nothing, yet said everything, and accepted the invitation. And then, they danced. There was no explicit contact, no indecent gestures, but there was surrender. She smiled with a kind of lightness he no longer saw at home, with a naturalness that didn't belong in the corporate environment, and her gaze avoided his, like someone who already knows they're being watched, like someone who doesn't want to face the truth in the reflection of the one they love. Daniel left the party early, with a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain in words. In the taxi, he stared out the window, seeing nothing. The city lights seemed more aggressive, more false, as if each glow carried a lie. When he got home, he sat on the couch and remained there, silent, for hours. The images of the dance, her smile, the way his boss held her from behind, everything seemed choreographed to hurt him without saying a word. The next day, Helena returned as if nothing had happened. She told stories about the party, their conversations, complimented the decorations, but avoided any mention of the dancing. He listened attentively, without interrupting. He memorized every detail of the omission. He didn't comment. Not then. It was too early to accuse. Daniel was never impulsive. He needed to be sure. In the days that followed, he began to observe more closely. He noticed the messages on her phone, the sudden screen freezes, the muffled giggles while typing. Schedules became more flexible. Evening meetings arose frequently. Saturday lunches turned into, "I need to stop by the office real quick." Hugs became rare. Kisses, bureaucratic. Her presence in the house felt like an echo of another woman. Daniel didn't question it immediately. On the contrary, he became even more kind. He cooked dinners, left the bath towel folded, bought her favorite wines. He wanted to see how far she would go. He wanted to know if what he felt was paranoia or revelation. And worst of all, he wanted to hope he was wrong. Helena, for her part, seemed to live in two parallel realities. At home, she maintained a mechanical cordiality, asked questions about his work, and laughed quietly. But in her eyes, Daniel saw a kind of emotional distance he no longer knew how to bridge. There were no arguments, just a complicit silence between two strangers sharing the same roof. He tried to bridge the gap, suggested a trip, insisted on dinner out, tried to reconnect her with memories, but every proposal was followed by evasive excuses. And the more he tried, the more she slipped through his fingers like sand. Until one Saturday afternoon, when Helena said she was leaving for an emergency meeting, Daniel decided to follow her. Not on impulse, but because there was something in her tone that no longer matched the truth. He kept his distance, watched from afar, and saw what he didn't want to see. Her car parking on a residential street, the door being opened by him, the same man from the dance, and the embrace. A hug too long to be casual, too intimate to be professional. Daniel didn't approach. He didn't make a fuss. He just stood there, in the car, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, feeling his chest burn silently. The confirmation of what he already knew hit him not like a punch, but like a slow poisoning. And there, alone in the parking lot of a strange neighborhood, he realized the marriage had ended long before that afternoon. She returned home dry-eyed. She didn't cry. She didn't explode. She didn't call anyone. She just sat at the table and began to write. Not letters, not notes, but loose notes. Words that could help her understand the breaking point, the exact moment she stopped being the love of her life. She remembered the times she'd defended her, the times she'd prioritized her dreams over her own, the sleepless nights planning birthdays, the surprises, the weekends planned around what she loved. And now, none of that seemed to have left a trace. She'd traded the essential for the occasional. The solid for the fleeting. When she returned, she lied. She said the meeting had been long. That she was exhausted. She went to bed early. Daniel observed everything with the serenity of someone already in another emotional dimension. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed more. He wanted to know if she would have the courage to tell the truth. But in the following days, Helena kept up the act. She kept coming and going, kept smiling when necessary, kept sleeping beside him as if there were no other bed. And that, for Daniel, was the most painful part. Not the betrayal itself, but her ability to live a lie with such control. As if it didn't consume her. As if the truth were irrelevant in the face of desire. It was then, on an ordinary morning, that something Helena said truly woke him up. She referred to the other man as, my boss, with an intimacy disguised as formality. A pause too short, a lopsided smile, a gleam in her eyes that didn't belong in that conversation. And Daniel understood. There was no longer any doubt. There was no longer any room for the benefit of the doubt. The betrayal wasn't a hypothesis. It was a fact. And that night, as she slept, he watched her silently. He looked at her face, so serene, so peaceful, and wondered how someone could cheat and still sleep peacefully. There was no remorse there. There was decision. There was choice. And perhaps, in her mind, it was all justifiable. Perhaps she believed she deserved something more. That Daniel was too predictable, too ordinary, and that this drove her into the arms of another. But what she would never understand was that the predictability of a secure love is what keeps an entire life going. The next morning, he waited for her in the kitchen. He was calm. His words were ready. He told her he knew. That he no longer needed explanations. That the dancing, the schedules, the lies, it had all been part of a narrative she'd constructed herself. And then, he looked her in the eyes and said that if she'd only been honest, he would have left without regrets. But what she did, was choose the cruelest path. Helena tried to react, tried to deny it, but her voice trembled. The mask slipped. And there, in that moment, Daniel saw the woman he slept with every night as a complete stranger. She cried, asked for time, tried to argue. But he didn't argue. He simply said he was going. He grabbed the backpack he'd already packed in the closet and left. In the hallway of the building, she could smell breakfast still in the air. And as the elevator descended, a thought entered her mind, maybe she'd believed it would never be discovered. Maybe she'd thought he'd never notice. Or maybe, she'd thought he'd never have the courage to leave. But what she didn't know, was that Daniel was about to discover something even bigger. Something that would change the course of their story forever. Something that would make it clear that, no matter how deep the pit of grief, the bottom was still to come. The light rain dripping down the apartment window that night seemed to repeat in droplets everything Daniel had felt in the last few days. A kind of damp, silent, insistent melancholy. He was no longer there, not physically. But he still carried within him the traces of that house. He still knew every corner, every sound of the creaking wooden floor, every scent Helena left on the pillow, every light she forgot to turn on. Time had passed since his departure, but the taste of the wound was still fresh, and more than the pain of betrayal, what hurt now was the emptiness. A heavy emptiness, full of unanswered questions, with a silence that screamed in the moments when no one was around. But it was in this silence that Daniel began to see what he hadn't seen before. The marks of what you spent years ignoring. Because sometimes absence speaks louder than any presence. The secret, however, didn't come from where he expected. It didn't come from a confession, nor from a confrontation. It came from chance. From a coincidence that could only have been written by life, meant to expose what was hidden. He had decided to return some things that were with him. A gesture of closure. Nothing dramatic. Just a box with photos, books, objects that belonged to the routine that had once been theirs. When he arrived at the building, he didn't announce he was coming. He walked up with firm steps, determined not to linger. He rang the doorbell and waited. Helena opened the door with a look of alarm on her face, but quickly tried to hide it, smiling uncomfortably. He held out the box, saying only that he thought it would be more respectful to deliver it in person. She thanked him, hesitated for a moment, and then invited him in. She said she needed to talk, that there were things he deserved to know. Daniel entered. The space was the same, but something had changed. There was a strange air in the apartment, as if the home had been emptied of its soul. The plants were wilted, the picture frames were gone, and in place of memories, there were only cold, white walls. They sat facing each other. She began with an apology, not for what he already knew, but for what she was yet to say. Her voice trembled, but there was sincerity there. She looked him in the eye and began to speak in a way he had never heard before. She spoke of the emptiness she had felt for years, of how she had lost herself, of the illusion of believing that someone from outside could fill a hole she had dug herself. She talked about her boss, about the encounters, about the wrong choice. But none of this was new to Daniel. He had already made peace with that part of the story. What surprised him came later. She said that, months before everything fell apart, she found an old notebook tucked away in the back of her closet. In it were all of Daniel's notes, written over the years. Travel plans they never made, gift ideas for future dates, letters he started writing but never had the courage to deliver, outbursts about how he felt increasingly invisible, about the struggle to keep his marriage alive even when he felt alone. Each page was a desperate attempt to reconnect. Helena read it all. And even after reading it, even after seeing with her own eyes everything he still tried to be for her, she chose the other man. It was this part she revealed with tears in her eyes. She knew. She knew how much he loved her. She knew everything he was trying to keep together. And yet, he continued with the betrayal. This is what Daniel didn't expect to hear. Her conscience wasn't blind. It was complicit. But what really unraveled him was what came next. In the middle of the conversation, Helena mentioned the financial aid her younger brother had received months ago. She said she was relieved because her brother had managed to finish college thanks to a guardian angel who, he said, had appeared anonymously, covering the overdue tuition fees, preventing him from being dismissed from the university. Daniel stared at her, but said nothing. He just listened. Helena continued, saying she'd always found it strange that her brother never told her who this person was. He'd said he promised not to reveal, that he owed her eternal gratitude, and that one day, everything would make sense. It was at that moment that something fell over her like an avalanche. Her eyes widened, and she looked at Daniel as if suddenly putting together all the pieces of a cruel puzzle. She understood. His silence confirmed it. The man who secretly paid for her brother's college for 2 years, without ever asking for recognition or thanks, was him. Helena put her hand to her mouth, as if trying to stop the tears from coming out. She asked why. Why she never told him. Daniel took a deep breath and responded with a calmness only someone who has bled too much can achieve. He said he didn't do it for her. He did it because his brother deserved it. Because he saw in him a dream that shouldn't be interrupted by money. He said that true love isn't limited to what's visible. That the love he felt for her extended to the people she loved. And that, even though he'd already felt distant at that time, he still believed he could save what they had. Helena broke down. The tears came hard. She fell to her knees, saying she was a coward, that she didn't deserve a man like him, that she now understood the gravity of what she had destroyed. She begged for forgiveness. She said she'd traded the essential for something disposable. That she'd been wrong, that she hadn't known the value of what she had until she saw him walk away empty-handed and heartbroken. Daniel lifted her off the ground. He looked into her eyes. He said he forgave her. But that forgiveness wasn't a bridge back. It was a key to freedom. That there was no more love between them, only respect. That he was moving on, not out of pride, but because love is also knowing when to let go. He said it wasn't love that was over, it was dignity that had been betrayed. And that some wounds, even healed, leave scars that prevent any new beginning. Helena asked for another chance. She said she would change, that now she saw everything clearly. But he shook his head with a sad and definitive regret. He said that sometimes, the love of your life comes, and leaves. And that all that remains is to learn to live with the absence of the one who was once everything. That night, Daniel left the apartment for the last time. He took nothing else with him. He didn't look back. He walked down the wet street with light steps, as if freeing himself from an invisible weight. And somewhere along the way, a small smile appeared on his face. Not of happiness. But of peace. The peace of someone who did everything they could. The peace of someone who loved until the end. The peace of someone who chose to carry on even after falling. And Helena, on the other side of the closed door, was left with the pain of someone who only understood the value of what she had when there was no hope of recovery. The pain that remains is not of betrayal. It is of regret that comes too late. And that, no one can heal. Daniel never returned to his old apartment. After that last conversation, after seeing Helena collapse in the face of her own guilt, he understood that everything had been said, everything that needed to be heard had already been heard, and that persisting in that place would only be extending a story whose ending had already been decided. He moved to a small loft downtown, a smaller, quieter space, but one that held something essential for him at that moment, the freshness of a new beginning. The first few weeks were filled with a mixture of relief and heavy silence. There was no longer the sound of her heels clicking down the hallway, no echoing laughter in the shared bathroom, no familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee that always preceded her on Saturday mornings. But there were also no more doubts, no averted glances, no subtle excuses. There was, for the first time in a long time, peace. And this peace, though lonely, was honest. At work, Daniel threw himself intensely into projects that had previously seemed minor. He began accepting bigger challenges, was asked to lead a new team, and began attending events, lunches, and gatherings he had previously avoided. It wasn't out of pride, nor a desire to show he had overcome. It was simply because, little by little, his heart no longer ached as it once did, and time, that old ally of those who suffer in silence, began to act on his essence, like fine sandpaper that wears away the edge of pain until it transforms it into learning. But despite this, there were still moments when absence felt present. Like the nights he returned from dinner and no one was waiting. Or on Sundays, when the silence seemed to weigh more heavily on the walls. Yet, he didn't shy away from it. He allowed himself to feel. Not to cultivate the pain, but to give it the space it needed before finally leaving. Helena tried to contact him a few times after their last conversation. She sent short messages, long emails, and even a handwritten letter. Not to ask for more chances, but to try to be heard one last time. She said she had started therapy, that she was trying to understand the choices she made, that she wasn't seeking forgiveness because she had already received it, but wanted him to know that the pain she felt now was real. Daniel read everything but didn't respond. He kept the words as records of a time that no longer belonged to him. Somewhere along the way, he understood that some things cannot be undone, even with regret. And that certain apologies, no matter how sincere, have no power to restore what was violated. Not out of revenge, but because there are feelings that, once broken, cannot be reassembled. On the other side, Helena was also trying to rebuild her life. After Daniel's departure and the natural drift away from mutual friends, who clearly knew everything, she found herself alone in a space that had once been home. The apartment became a constant reminder of what she'd lost. She tried redecorating, moving furniture around, painting the walls, but the emptiness remained, unchanging. Her boss, the man she'd destroyed her marriage for, had distanced himself shortly afterward. A natural drift, without much explanation. Helena realized, too late, that there had never been any real promises there. Just a game of vanity and ego that ended the moment she lost what was most valuable to her. Now, she was trying to find herself, understand where she'd lost herself, and how she'd been able to ignore so many signs. It was on a random night, at one of those social events Daniel had previously avoided, that he met Clara. She was an architect, talkative, with a sparkle in her eyes that evoked freedom. There was nothing extraordinary about their first meeting. It was just an exchange of words over dinner, a comment about the wine, a joke about the waiter's delay, and a light smile that lingered longer than usual. But there was a sincerity, an absence of pressure, that caught his attention. In the weeks that followed, they met again, in groups, at lunches, and occasionally, alone. Daniel wasn't looking for anything. But he also didn't shy away from the possibility of something new. And Clara, with her easygoing manner, seemed to understand his silences, respect his time, and most importantly, didn't try to occupy spaces that weren't hers. The relationship with Clara grew slowly, unhurriedly, but deeply. Daniel began to realize that life doesn't end when love ends, it just transforms. And that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what you truly want. Clara never asked directly about Helena, but she knew there was a story there, a scar that still hurt on cold days. And when he finally decided to tell her, he didn't hold back. Not to dramatize, but to be honest. And she listened, with fixed eyes and steady hands, and in the end, simply said that you can't change the past, but you can choose what to do with the present. One afternoon, while Daniel was sorting through some old papers, he found one of the letters he had written to Helena years ago but never had the courage to deliver. It was simple, but true. It spoke of how invisible he felt within his marriage, how he wanted her to notice his silent struggle, how he still believed they could meet halfway. When he finished reading it, he realized he was no longer that man. That Daniel was in the past, in that apartment, in that story. He kept the letter, not with pain, but as if gently closing a door. Helena, for her part, now lived with a conscience heavier than any loneliness. She lost friendships, lost respect, and most of all, lost the man who truly loved her. In a chance encounter at the supermarket, months later, they saw each other for the first time since that last night. It was brief. A long look, a restrained greeting. Helena tried to force a smile, but soon gave in to the weight of the memory. Daniel, on the other hand, was serene. There was no more anger, no more hurt, just emotional distance. She asked how he was, and he responded kindly. He said he was fine. And as she watched him leave, with calm steps and a light posture, Helena felt the weight of an irreversible truth: there was no longer room for her in his life. And that, in the end, the true punishment for betrayal was not abandonment, but irrevocable regret. In the months that followed, Daniel and Clara deepened their relationship. They went traveling, began sharing weekends, and little by little, he realized he could be happy again. Not in the same way. He never is. But in a new, lighter, more attentive way. He understood that love isn't about intensity, but about presence. And that those who choose to cheat don't just wrong the other person, but also themselves. Because they destroy what could have been eternal. Helena continued trying to rebuild herself. She continued therapy, went back to school, tried to reclaim parts of herself that had been forgotten. But what she could never recover was Daniel's gaze. That gaze full of admiration, tenderness, and belonging. That gaze was gone. And it was then that she understood that sometimes, punishment doesn't come with shouting or revenge. It comes with silence. With absence. With life going on without you. And when, on a cold night, she sat alone at the table where they had so often dined together, she understood that the love of her life wasn't the one who gave her butterflies, but the one who was there on cloudy days, who washed the dishes in silence, who waited for her to come home from work even when exhausted, who paid for her brother's college education without ever saying a word, simply because he knew how much it meant to her. And now, all that was lost. Because one day, she chose the new. The uncertain. The fleeting glow. And, in the end, that was all that remained, a void where love once stood. Time passed with treacherous delicacy, like someone trying not to make a sound while reassembling what's left of a shattered story. Each day seemed to bring a new layer of understanding about everything that had happened, and even though Daniel harbored no resentment, there were moments when he still found himself reliving details, memories, and fragments that didn't ask permission to return. It wasn't a constant pain, nor an attachment to the past, but rather the inevitable process of rebuilding oneself after giving up everything and receiving silence in return. He had found peace, yes, but true peace isn't the absence of memories, it's living with them without letting them destroy you from within. And that's exactly what Daniel learned to do, live with them. With the scars, with the emptiness, with the words he never heard, and with the ones he never could say. Clara became, day by day, a more solid presence. They didn't rush each other, didn't rush things, didn't try to pretend to be something they weren't yet. She had the tact of someone who understands that haste is the enemy of those who have loved deeply. Daniel admired the way she respected his silence, how she didn't ask questions when she sensed he was revisiting old thoughts, and how she also knew exactly the right moment to speak. There was no pressure, just company. And that, for him, was new. Loving after being hurt takes courage, but more than that, it requires a willingness to relearn what surrender means. And that was what he was trying to do, relearn. Clara made him laugh effortlessly, challenged him with intelligent conversations, and had a light-hearted way of touching on deep topics that broke down any remaining resistance. With her, he didn't need to prove anything, nor hide that he'd been hurt. She knew his story, respected his pain, but didn't compete with it. And that was rare. Rare and precious. Meanwhile, on the other side, Helena was going through a process that, unlike Daniel's, wasn't about starting over, but about confronting. Therapy made her delve into memories she herself had tried to bury. It was like revisiting the scenes of her own mistake from a new perspective, crueler, more honest. For the first time, she faced not only what she did, but what she didn't do. She realized that the betrayal didn't begin with the other person's kiss, but with every small gesture of disregard, with every silent disregard for Daniel's attempts to keep them together. She understood that fidelity isn't just about not sleeping with someone else, but about being present with integrity, about not turning a blind eye to the other person's pain, about not pretending that distance is just a phase when, in fact, it's emotional neglect. And perhaps this was her greatest punishment, having to face herself. Having to live with the knowledge that she hurt someone who never hurt her, that she destroyed the only place where she was truly loved, completely. Her life was now silent, not just in volume, but in soul. Friends naturally drifted away, not out of malice, but out of loyalty. Those who knew Daniel, who saw her pain up close, couldn't sustain a relationship with someone who had caused such a rupture. At work, she maintained her composure, delivered results, but she was no longer the same. Her former brilliance was replaced by an almost constant seriousness. The outgoing woman gave way to a more introspective, more conscious figure. She often felt strange to herself, as if she had left behind the most vivid version of herself. She tried, for a time, to get closer to her family, to rebuild ties, but even then, there were wounds. The discovery of Daniel's anonymous financial support for her brother had left scars that were difficult to erase. Her brother, upon learning the full story, distanced himself. Discreetly but firmly. He told her, in a few words, that one day she would understand the magnitude of what she had destroyed. There were no more messages, no more calls. A dry silence. And the truth is, she understood. More than she wanted to. Daniel, for his part, was beginning to see his life take on a new shape. A new apartment, new routines, new choices. He was beginning to allow himself to dream of things that previously seemed too distant. Traveling with Clara was among them. She invited him for a weekend away, to a guest house surrounded by greenery and silence. He accepted, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. During the trip, the two hiked trails, shared stories from the past, laughed at trivial situations, and in a moment of pause, sitting before a sweeping view of mountains and clear skies, Clara held his hand and said that sometimes the love of our lives isn't the one who arrives first, but the one who arrives later and shows us that we are still capable of loving. Daniel didn't respond immediately, but the look in his eyes said it all. There, in that moment, he felt that, perhaps for the first time in a long time, there were no more remnants of the past dominating his steps. But not everything in life goes smoothly. Even with his heart rebuilding, moral dilemmas persisted. One ordinary evening, while having coffee at a small restaurant, Daniel ran into a mutual friend he hadn't seen in months. She approached, they exchanged greetings, chatted about trivialities, but at one point, she mentioned Helena. She said she'd seen her recently, that she seemed exhausted, emotionally drained, and that she was clearly paying a heavy price for everything she'd done. Daniel listened without reacting, but something stirred inside. It wasn't longing, nor pity. It was simply the weight of knowing that, even from a distance, there was still an invisible bond connecting him to that woman. A bond made of history, of the past, of everything they'd experienced. Her friend, sensing his discomfort, changed the subject, but the seed had already been planted. That night, Daniel reflected more than he would have liked. He thought about forgiveness, about rebuilding, about how each person reacts differently to guilt. He wondered if it had been possible to save her from herself. He thought, finally, that perhaps loving someone doesn't mean saving them, but knowing when to let them sink so they can learn to swim on their own. And it was with this thought that he fell asleep, in a different kind of peace than before. A mature, more conscious peace. A peace that knew that, while he was still part of her pain, he was no longer responsible for healing it. Clara noticed something different about him in the following days. It wasn't coldness, nor distance, but a more present kind of introspection. During dinner, she looked at him with a firm gaze and told him she knew he still carried a part of his past, and that it was okay. That loving someone who's hurt means understanding that love isn't always enough, but respect is. He smiled, took her hand, and thanked her. He said he was trying, and that she helped him more than he could have imagined. There was no rush there. Just space. And space was all he needed. Meanwhile, Helena was making important decisions. She began selling the furniture from her old apartment. She wanted a change of environment, of atmosphere, of scenery. Not to forget Daniel, but to no longer have to relive, every day, the ghost of her wrong choice. With each piece that left, a memory was released. And with that, she began to glimpse a possibility that, for a long time, seemed impossible, moving on without the illusion of return. Accepting that the love she lost would not return. That the man who destroyed his own finances to support his family without asking for anything in return was no longer in her life. And that this was final. It hurt, but it was necessary. The pain of regret only transforms into healing when one accepts that the past cannot be redrawn. But the moral dilemma was still there. Inside her. An internal conflict between wanting to redeem herself and knowing that, sometimes, the greatest form of redemption is to no longer interfere in the lives of those she hurt. Helena wanted to meet Daniel one last time, not to ask for anything more, but to thank him for everything he was. For everything he tried. For everything she failed to appreciate. But she hesitated. She knew that reappearing could be selfishness disguised as regret. And she remained at this impasse. Between the desire to apologize again and the maturity of knowing that, perhaps, the greatest respect she could offer was silence. For Daniel, life was taking on more solid shape. Plans with Clara stopped being possibilities and became decisions. New projects emerged. A new routine was established. But even so, what surprised him most was the lightness with which he faced what had previously been pain. He understood that he didn't need to forget Helena to move on. That feelings don't need to be buried, just relocated. The love he once felt still existed, but now transformed into a learning experience. And that, more than anything else, was his victory. And as Clara lay beside him that night, her head resting on his shoulder and her fingers intertwined with his, Daniel looked up at the ceiling and thought that life, despite all its downfalls, still knew how to surprise. He still knew how to reward those who remained true to their feelings, even when they were hurt. He still knew how to bring back the light to those who had the courage to cross the darkness without losing their true selves. And it was in that moment of silence, with his heart serene and his eyes closed, that he knew, everything he had experienced was not in vain. Because, in the end, even the deepest pain takes us exactly where we need to be. The following days were of transition, and this transition wasn't just spatial or routine, but existential. Daniel, who until then had been absorbing the new with a calm maturity, began to feel, for the first time in a long time, the need to do something more for himself. It wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the history he'd lived, but about finding a new way to position himself in the world, as a man, as an individual, as someone who had loved deeply, been betrayed, and yet chosen not to become bitter. For the first time, he felt the urge to be alone by choice, not out of pain. He told Clara that he was going away for a few days, in a secluded place, to reflect. She understood with a serenity that surprised him, smiled, and said she would wait for him, that true love doesn't pressure, simply follows the other person's pace. Daniel smiled back gratefully, and knew, in that moment, that it was no longer about healing a wound, but about understanding who he had become after all this. He drove to a small town surrounded by mountains and calm rivers. He rented a simple wooden house with large windows and a large porch, the kind of place where time slows down without asking permission. He spent the first few days in silence, reading, writing, walking unfamiliar trails. It was as if he needed to empty himself of the city's voices, the buzz of memories, so he could finally hear himself. He took nothing that connected him directly to his old life. Just a few clothes, a blank notebook, and an old clock his father had given him, which, curiously, always stopped when he needed time most. In those slow hours, he thought about everything he had experienced with Helena, but now with the emotional distance necessary to see without anger, without judgment, only with the clear awareness that love, however true, was not enough when it was not reciprocated in care, presence, and loyalty. During one of his walks, he passed an elderly gentleman, who greeted him with a gentle wave. They sat on a wooden bench beneath an ancient tree, and the conversation began with pleasantries, the weather, the tranquility of the place, the beauty of the night sky. But, as happens when two silences meet, they were soon immersed in deeper questions. The old man spoke of the wife he had lost 20 years ago and the peace he found in solitude. He said that love leaves its mark, but it is the choice of how we carry those marks that defines our path. Daniel listened, and at a certain point, when he found himself speaking of Helena without mentioning her name, he noticed that the pain in his voice was gone, only the maturity of someone who had finally understood that forgiving is not forgetting, but rather freeing oneself from the obligation to carry what is no longer one's. On one of the coldest nights of that week, sitting on the porch with a blanket draped over his shoulders and a mug of tea in his hands, he received an unexpected call. It was Helena. She no longer insisted on trying to return, didn't ask for dates, simply saying that, while emptying the apartment completely, she found something that belonged to her, a hand-drawn drawing he'd scribbled years ago, depicting a future home they'd dreamed of building. She said she couldn't bring herself to throw it away, that she didn't want to return it, but also didn't know if it still held any meaning. Daniel remained silent on the other end of the line for a few seconds. Then, he replied that he didn't want the paper back because the house he'd dreamed of building with her no longer existed. But he thanked her for keeping it. Helena, moved, apologized again, but this time not for the betrayal. She apologized for not being able to realize, at the right time, that she was loved completely. Daniel thanked her for the gesture, wished her well, and hung up. And in that moment, he no longer felt anything pulling him back. Upon returning from his trip, he found Clara at the door, smiling, a sparkle in her eyes and a curious look in her eyes. She hugged him, and when he said he needed to tell her everything he'd felt these past few days, she simply replied that she had all the time in the world to listen. They sat on the sofa, and he spoke unhurriedly. Not just about Helena, but about himself, about the discoveries he'd made, about the lightness he'd found in realizing he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Clara listened in silence, holding his hand, and when he finished, she told him she loved him not just for the man he was now, but for the man he'd chosen to remain, even after everything. For the way he'd carried his pain with dignity, for the way he'd not allowed bitterness to define his next steps. The following months were spent building a new love, now more conscious, freer from the shackles of the past. Daniel and Clara began talking about moving in together, about sharing their daily lives more organically. There was no rush, but there was a certainty that dispensed with excessive planning. He learned, from everything he'd experienced, that true love is simple. It doesn't require constant proof, but constant presence, small gestures, loyalty in the details. And that was what he found with Clara. There were no ghosts, no impossible promises, just the firmness of two adults who chose each other knowing what it's like to have their hearts shattered. With her, he discovered that it's possible to love again without comparison. That the new doesn't need to erase the old, but can blossom even over the scars, when there's respect and truth. Meanwhile, Helena began her own journey of reconstruction, this time more solidly. She decided to change careers, quit the job that had so often led her to lose herself. She began studying psychology, interested in understanding not only her own behavior but also the mechanisms that lead so many people to destroy what they love most. She wanted to transform her guilt into something useful, to do things differently, even if she could never fix what she had caused. She volunteered at a social project, dedicating part of her weekends to listening to stories of pain, loss, and new beginnings. And there, among strangers, she began to find some meaning in the pain she carried. She wasn't seeking redemption, but transformation. And this, though belated, was real. One spring afternoon, almost a year after their separation, Daniel received a letter. Handwritten, signed by Helena. It was different from the previous ones. It didn't ask for forgiveness, it didn't mention guilt. It was a letter of recognition. She said that for a long time, she believed that love was only about intense feeling, but that she learned, the hard way, that love is a daily choice. It's presence. It's renunciation. And that he had done all of this. She said she now understood how small she had been compared to the immense love she had received, and that if she could leave a final message, it would be simply to tell him never to doubt the greatness of true love. She didn't ask for a reply. She ended by saying that she wished him happiness, the way he always deserved to be. Daniel put the letter away in a drawer, along with other memories that no longer hurt. It was like the final piece of a puzzle already complete. He knew that his story with Helena didn't define who he was, but it shaped who he became. And that night, as he prepared dinner with Clara, laughing over a recipe they'd made wrong, he realized he was exactly where he needed to be. Life didn't give you back what you lost. It gave you something new, different, but deeply true. And as he looked at her, her hair tied up haphazardly and her curious gaze on the sauce that was beginning to burn, he thought that sometimes life demands we lose everything to find what truly matters. And that, despite all the suffering, she remained whole. And that, more than anything else, was his greatest victory. Clara and Daniel's wedding took place on a sunny September afternoon in the garden of a secluded country house, where the greenery seemed to frame every detail of the ceremony. There were no exaggerations or theatrical promises, just looks that spoke volumes and sincere vows between two hearts that had learned, by force, the true meaning of love. They were surrounded by a few friends, some family, and a lightness in the air that betrayed the peace built after a path marked by losses, new beginnings, and conscious choices. Daniel was no longer the same man who once lived in swallowed silences, solitary hopes, and attempts to hold together a castle crumbling from within. He was now whole, not because someone had completed him, but because he had learned to rebuild himself piece by piece. And as he watched Clara enter, hand in hand with her little niece, with a calm smile and teary eyes, he knew that every painful step had led him exactly to this point. The kiss sealed a new stage, but unlike what many think, it wasn't the end of the pain, it was the beginning of a life that didn't need to erase the past, just respect it. After the ceremony, the two took a few days off to travel. They went to a quiet coastal village, where they walked barefoot, ate simple foods, and laughed at the inside jokes that emerged during long, carefree conversations. Clara liked collecting shells, Daniel liked writing stray passages on napkins. They didn't talk about the past often, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer hurt. There was acceptance, and above all, gratitude, for everything they'd experienced, for everything they'd lost, and for what they'd finally found in each other. Helena, however, found herself in a different landscape, far removed from that sunny vista. Years had passed, and her life followed a different rhythm, more introspective, quieter. She was living in a smaller, more modest apartment on a less busy street. She left behind the corporate environment that had consumed her so much and now dedicated herself to psychology, having already graduated, working in a community clinic where she heard stories of hurt, confused, and regretful people. She felt useful, but never fulfilled. There was a weight that wouldn't leave her, no matter how many stories she heard, how many lives she helped. It was the weight of what could not be undone, of the wrong choice made at the exact moment she should have chosen the right one. She tried to keep moving, went out with some colleagues, read a lot, wrote articles on empathy and forgiveness, but there were days when emptiness knocked loudly on her door. It was on these days that she would take out the box where she kept everything that remained of Daniel, the letter he never knew she read, the note from a random birthday, a photo of them on a trip to the mountains, and the drawing of the house he had envisioned for them. She never had the courage to part with it. She kept it as a bitter but necessary reminder of who she once was, and who she no longer wanted to be. One night, as she closed her eyes after a long day of appointments, Helena received a notification on her phone. It was a photo sent by an old friend, the kind life had taken away, but who still retained a trace of affection. In the image, Daniel appeared with Clara and a child in his arms, in a random park, smiling with the kind of happiness you can't force. The caption simply said, "They're beautiful together." Helena stared at the image for long minutes. She cried. Not out of jealousy, nor out of a desire to have that back, but out of a dull pain knowing she'd lost the only love she'd ever truly known, even when she didn't deserve it. And she knew, with a cruel certainty, that she would never see that look again. Not from Daniel, nor from any man. A few months later, fate, with its subtle and unpredictable irony, brought them face to face in a coffee shop near a charity event. Daniel was with Clara and their young daughter, who was learning to walk. Helena was alone, drinking coffee, reviewing her notes. Looking up, she saw them. Time seemed to stand still for a second. Clara noticed first and touched Daniel's arm. He turned to see her there, older, thinner, but with the same look he once knew so well. There was a silence between them, an exchange of glances that said it all. Helena stood, walked slowly over to where they were, smiled restrainedly, politely, and simply said, "She's beautiful." Daniel nodded in thanks and replied, "She has her mother's heart." Clara, elegantly, simply held her daughter's hand. Helena then looked into Daniel's eyes for the last time and said something that sounded like a final farewell, "Thank you for loving me. Even when I didn't know how to love back." And he left, without waiting for an answer. That same day, returning home, Clara asked Daniel if he was okay. He said yes, but he felt strange. As if a door he hadn't even realized was still ajar had finally closed. Clara hugged him from behind as he looked out the window, and said that life sometimes needs unexpected encounters to remind us how far we've come. Daniel kissed her on the forehead and whispered that he was exactly where he wanted to be. For the first time in years, he felt no heaviness when he remembered Helena. It was like looking at an old photograph of a life lived intensely but now only in the past. And so the story ended. Not with perfect endings, but with real endings. Daniel, the man who once believed that love was enough to keep a relationship alive, learned that true love requires reciprocity and respect. Clara, who entered his life like a light breeze after a storm, showed that love also means giving space, listening to silences, and walking alongside without the need to fix the other. And Helena, who paid a high price for choices made in haste, vanity, and illusion, found, at least, a way to not repeat the mistake with anyone else. Now it's your turn. Comment below what you thought of this story, which character touched you most, what surprised you most. We want to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share this story with someone who needs to hear a lesson like this. And what lesson is this? That betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, plans, entire homes, and most importantly, it destroys self-respect. A single wrong choice can forever drive the love of your life away, and sometimes forgiveness does come, but a new beginning, never again. Here on this channel, we do not condone any kind of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional, but the consequences we show are real, and reflect what so many people have experienced, or will experience if they don't open their eyes in time. Until the next story. And remember, those who love, care. Those who betray, lose. Always.